Donald Trump's presidency has been defined by bluster, bravado, and big claims. But recent signals show more signs of a climb down. They suggest a president still talking tough, but quietly looking for off-ramps. CIA Director John Ratcliffe has made a rare unannounced trip to Moscow for meetings with Russian officials. The agenda remains unclear, but the very fact that U.S. intelligence channel with Russia is active at this moment is significant, especially as Moscow is engaged in a war with Ukraine and remains a key player in the Iran conflict and the crisis. The biggest test, however, here is Iran. Washington is offering a potential trade-off. Sanctions and maritime pressure could be eased if Tehran agrees to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and halt attacks by Iran-aligned groups. The message was reportedly carried to Tehran by Pakistan's Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir during his visit to Iran. In another sign of de-escalation, the United States is starting to return diplomatic staff to West Asia missions that were evacuated or downsized during the war. Staff are being sent back to posts including Israel, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq, although some missions will operate below full strength. Washington says the move reflects a fresh assessment that the immediate risk of escalation has fallen. And U.S. is also treading carefully around China. The Trump administration is targeting Iran's oil network, including entities linked to China and Hong Kong, but has so far avoided a broader assault on major Chinese financial institutions. That caution comes as Trump prepares for a delicate relationship with Xi Jinping. Even as Trump confronts Iran, he is again praising his relationship with Kim Jong-un. Donald Trump has called for a substantial reduction in U.S.-South Korea military exercises, saying that they send an inappropriate and hostile signal to Pyongyang. But the pattern is hard to miss. On Russia, a direct intelligence channel. On Iran, a nudge to Pakistan for reigniting talks. On China, caution. And on North Korea, outreach. But at home, the political clock is ticking. Trump's approval rating has fallen to 33%, its lowest level in his presidency. Only 31% of Americans now support U.S. military action against Iran, and voters are increasingly worried about the economic cost of the war, particularly higher energy prices. With the midterms approaching, the question for Trump is no longer just whether he can win the war. It is whether he can end it without looking like he lost. Trump continues to project strength, but behind the rhetoric, the diplomatic movement is clear. Donald Trump may not be climbing down, but he does appear to be looking for a way down. Joining us live now on Point Counterpoint is Dr. Glenn Deason. He's joining us from Oslo, Norway, and is the Professor of International Relations at the University of Southeastern Norway. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us on the broadcast. The first question here is, there's so much of a diplomatic outreach going on as far as Donald Trump is concerned. We're looking at the CIA chief, his short visit in Russia. We're looking at an outreach via Pakistan to restart talks with Iran. And we're looking at the past statement of Scott Bessent, where he said that Trump will be calling all global leaders to ensure that economic pressure is maintained on Iran through all countries and not just the U.S. How are you viewing this, especially with respect to the entire political landscape that is unraveling in the U.S.?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. There's a lot actually happening, but for one can look at the domestic situation in the United States. I think political crisis is now quite obvious. As you argued, Trump's approval ratings are now very low. It also puts a huge threat for Trump and his party at the midterms coming up, but also for the United States. They are running now into a massive economic crisis. This hasn't begun to, the economy hasn't begun to unravel just yet, but all the indicators are suggesting that the bond markets can't be controlled anymore. And once this goes, you're going to have problem in the tech sector and beyond. So there's a lot of domestic problems they have to deal with. So it's a good which are good reasons for trying to pull out of this crisis. But also the actual front lines of the United States, they're not going well either. That is, America's war against Russia in Ukraine is not doing well. We see the Donbass is falling, is being encircled. We see also that overall the situation for Ukraine is going from bad to worse. There's not enough weapons. There's especially not enough air defenses and manpower. And you see a similar problem in the war against Iran. The United States simply has depleted its weapon stockpiles. It can't really escalate anymore to a big extent unless it brings out tactical nuclear weapons. So it's the military options are declining, and the battlefields of the United States are not going well. So I think that this is a reason for why they might start now to look towards a diplomatic option instead.
Well, you talk about diplomatic options, but this entire visit, if we may go back to it, of the CIA director now being in Russia for a very surprise visit, as we mentioned, do you think this could be a headway in terms of moving forward talks as far as Ukraine and Russia is concerned? Because we do know that it's a bit of a catch-22 situation as far as Iran is concerned. But looking at Russia and the Ukraine war and how Trump has always actively, ever since he came into the presidency as well, tried to at least reach a sense of atmosphere where the two countries can come together for peace talks. Now that we see that has been stalled for so long, especially not a lot of development after the Alaska summit where Putin and Trump met, do you think this would be now a way to restart those talks and probably put him back into the light of being a so-called peace president?
Well, there's been some talk about this. That is, as you said, there's been a long pause now because they met last year in Anchorage in Alaska, and the Americans came with a proposal. The Russians more or less accepted this. And then we saw the Americans beginning to walk the whole thing back. You heard Marco Rubio arguing that there was more optimism now of essentially squeezing a better deal out of the Russians because NATO, in cooperation with Ukraine, was engaged in these deep strikes into Russia. So they thought this could bring them more concessions. Now we see that this is not really the case. Instead, Ukraine is going from bad to worse. So there is, you hear now some comments coming out of Washington that it's time to revive the diplomacy with Russia, and I think that would be very wise to do before, if you see Ukraine collapsing, be it the military, the front lines, be it the economy, be it the political stability. All of these things are now very fragile. So it's a good idea to get the negotiations started before something begins to unravel. But to what extent it's possible to get a deal now, it remains to be seen. I think the first thing they have to do is get in place a new agreement for a new European security architecture because what we're fighting about now is essentially what we've been discussing for the past 30 years, I would say 35 years. That is, ever since the Cold War came to an end, the Russians have been saying that we need a mutually acceptable post-Cold War security architecture in Europe, that stability and peace can't depend on NATO just incrementally moving its military infrastructures, its missiles, and its membership closer and closer to the Russian borders. We didn't want to talk about this for 3 decades. We didn't essentially boycotted the diplomacy over the past 4.5 years, not wanting to talk to Russia about this since 2022. And I think that this is essentially what the US now has to discuss with the Russians. That is, how do we put an end to this NATO expansionism and restore Ukraine's neutrality, which isn't an easy task at all. So, but I'm assuming that, this would have to be one of the things they're discussing if they do want to make the diplomatic movement go forward.
Right. What do you make of this visit in terms of the ongoing tussle as far as Iran is concerned? Because Trump has multiple times spoken about his good personal relationship with the Russian president, and Putin on his part has also reiterated the same. Is this a leverage that Trump has, despite everything that probably is not really going in US's favor right now? Can Donald Trump really leverage that personal relationship in terms of trying to really get out of a sticky situation as far as the stalemate on Iran is concerned, and do that with Russia's help?
Well, I think having a good personal relationship is a good thing. And I think that's one of the things that Trump was able to to do, which other Western leaders can't. That is, he can actually meet with Kim Jong-un. He can actually talk to the Russians. In most of the West now, basic diplomacy has to a large extent become criminalized. You're not supposed to meet with your opponents. Diplomacy now means you sit in a room with people you already agree with. So I think his personal relationships is important. That being said, I do think he overestimates it. Whenever he speaks of his relationship with Kim Jong-un or Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, he always makes a big thing out of it, like this is essentially what stability and peace will depend on. But it can only go so far. And if you look at with Russia, the Americans never pulled away from this war. They're still supplying the weapons. They still have their intelligence agencies on the ground. They're the one picking targets. They're offering the intelligence. This is still very much an American proxy war. Trump is still very much engaged in, every day fighting against Russia, killing Russians. So it's not as if a personal relationship means everything. And it's the same with China. And you can also say as I said, with North Korea. That is, having a great relationship is good, but it has to have something else beneath it. So to what extent he's able, I think, all of the above, all these leaders now, because they have a relationship with Trump, they're willing to meet, they're willing to discuss, but there's no trust, and they're not going to make any unilateral concessions based on Trump's stated intentions, because I think all these leaders have also looked towards what Trump has done in Iran, which is time and time again make deals and then pull out of them immediately, or simply using the negotiations as a way of making the opponent lower their guard so he can launch another surprise attack. The Russians are more or less reaching the conclusion. This is what happened in Anchorage as well. That is, nothing came out of it. The Americans proposed an agreement, and once the Russians agreed to it, they actually walked it back themselves. So the trust in Trump and his diplomacy, I think, is very low. But again, one shouldn't underestimate the value of having proper relations.
Right. Clearly, I mean, it's a very high-stakes situation as far as all the war fronts are concerned. And also in the backdrop of the midterms, can his personal relationships truly be leveraged? That is, of course, going to be the big question. And will the voters in America buy it? Again, that's the bigger question. That was Dr. Glenn Deason joining us on the broadcast. Dr. Gleason, thank you so much for speaking to us here on WION.
Thank you.